Here's William Lane Craig to try to explain why God's existence doesn't need a cause.
Have you ever thought about the fact that you might not have existed? After all, there's no reason to think you had to exist. If circumstances had been different, you might never have been born. The only reason any of us exists is that we were caused to exist. We're dependent on something other than ourselves. Our existence is contingent. But that's not the case with God.
Of course not. Things that don't exist at all don't exist contingently either.
He exists independently of anything else.
That doesn't make any sense. To exist means to have location in space-time, so the only thing that exists independent of anything else is space-time itself. To say that something exists independent of space-time is to say that it exists without existing anywhere or at any time. That's a contradiction.
That is to say, God is self-existent. This attribute of self-existence is sometimes called aseity, from the Latin a se, which means from itself. So we're saying God exists from himself. John writes in his gospel, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God."
John was the latest gospel to be written, and it's suspiciously the only gospel to say anything about the Word being God. That seems like a pretty theologically important point, so it's rather odd that none of the previous gospel authors thought that it was worth mentioning.
He was in the beginning with God. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was made. Here, John talks about the uncreated Word, which was God, that existed in the beginning. By contrast, everything else has come into being through the creative power of the Word.
In order for space-time to come into being, there had to be a time when it didn't already exist, which is a contradiction. There was obviously never a time when time didn't already exist.
There is a distinction drawn here between God, the uncreated creator, and everything else which depends for its existence upon God and his Word. God is uniquely set apart as self-existent and uncreated.
Sounds like a special plea to me.
Thus, Scripture indicates that God is the sole ultimate reality, the creator of all things other than himself. God's aseity confronts a serious challenge from one of the oldest and most persistent philosophical doctrines, Platonism.
Platonism isn't persistent. Hardly anybody in philosophy takes the idea of Platonic forms seriously anymore, and even Plato's student Aristotle didn't buy it.
Which holds that in addition to concrete objects like people and planets, there also exist separate realms of abstract objects like numbers, propositions, and properties.
These things are all just as physical as concrete objects. They all have to have location in space-time in order to coherently be said to exist at all. None of them can be said to exist independent of space-time without contradiction.
Platonists hold that these abstract objects are every bit as real as the familiar physical objects of our daily experience.
That's because they too are physical. Many of them are ideas, and ideas are actions carried out by brains. They are physical actions.
And they exist necessarily, for it is inconceivable that there should exist, for example, a possible world where there are no numbers or propositions.
In what sense would numbers, which are ideas, exist in a universe without brains to think of those ideas? Perhaps someone who subscribes to this idea believes, for example, that in a reality in which just 2 planets exist, and there are no life forms with brains, in order to say that 2 planets exist, we would have to infer that the number 2 exists in that reality. This, however, would be an externally formulated description of that reality. It wouldn't be proof that the number 2 exists there. Numbers are like any other system we invented to organize things. For example, we can say that the summer solstice solstice of the year 1 million BCE happened in the month of June, according to our current calendar, despite the fact that our current calendar, and even the month of June itself, hadn't been invented yet. We can retroactively apply our calendar even to years that occurred before it ever existed. Analogously, we can use numbers to count objects even in hypothetical realities in which numbers do not exist. This creates the illusion that numbers exist in all hypothetical realities.
Moreover, and this is the crucial point, Platonists assert that abstract objects are self-existent.
That's why very few philosophers take Platonism seriously anymore. Even Aristotle didn't believe that self-existent Platonic forms existed. Aristotle thought it was absurd to think that there are any such entities as numbers that have their own ontology independent of the things being counted.
And uncreated, just like God.
And the idea that any of these things have any kind of non-physical ontology is equally absurd.
Thus, God is no longer the sole ultimate reality, but is reduced to but one self-existent being among many. How do Christian theists respond to the challenge of Platonism? Fortunately, a wide range of alternatives to Platonism is available. One such alternative, neutralism, points out that we often talk about things as if they were objects, even though we know they're not.
Yeah, like God.
For example, when I say the price of the ticket is $10, that statement is true, even though I don't think for a moment that there's an object called a price floating around somewhere.
I don't think this is a good example. Craig seems to think that applying a noun to an idea is the same as treating it like an object.
The adventures of Sherlock Holmes are fictional, not primarily because the brilliant detective never existed, but because the author wants us to imagine that he did exist. Pretense theory considers mathematical discourse to be a kind of make-believe. We are merely pretending or imagining that mathematical objects like numbers exist, even though they are no more real than fictional characters like Sherlock Holmes.
I don't really think of numbers as existing objects, even in a pretend sense. If I did, I'd be pretending that the concept of a number has a referent, and I don't need to even pretend that numbers have referents in order to use them or talk about them.
So the challenge of Platonism is far from insuperable. Those of us who are committed to God's aseity can choose these or a number of other alternatives when responding to Platonists. Moreover, God is not just self-existent, as great as that is, but also necessarily existent. God doesn't just happen to exist. Rather, since God is the greatest conceivable being, his attributes aren't just pretty good, they're as great as they can conceivably be.
I don't see how you can define great in any objective way. This argument assumes that existence is in some sense greater than non-existence. This isn't clearly the case. Also, this argument tries to simply define God into existence. To say that something exists is to say that it's more than merely fictional. And to say that something is more than merely fictional is to say that it is more than merely a concept. Rather, it is a concept with a referent that exists independent of the concept that represents it. The argument Craig is making here is called the ontological argument, and every version of this argument fails because it essentially tries to prove that God is more than just a concept by using nothing but concepts.
It follows that God's existence isn't merely contingent like ours. It's necessary, because necessary existence is greater than contingent existence.
Why?
We can also talk about this using possible worlds terminology. Possible worlds are simply ways the world could be. Now, if God is the greatest conceivable being, he doesn't exist in merely one or a few possible worlds. He exists in every possible world.
Which means that if there's a single conceivable hypothetical reality in which God does not exist, then God, by this definition, does not exist at all. Since it is pretty easy to coherently propose a possible world without God, God does not inhabit all possible worlds, and insofar as inhabiting all possible worlds is inherent to God's definition, God therefore does not exist. To everyone who helps me out on Patreon, you're a big help. Thanks so much.